Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where in the world you're coming into our webcast today. We're excited about this topic, the future of agriculture and food. And the one thing, unlike a lot of our other topics, there's no niche on this one. Everybody is affected by, if you eat, I guess, if you don't eat, maybe you're not affected, but everybody is affected by this topic. We have four illustrious panelists that we're about to introduce on our webcast, and this will be drinking through the fire hose, I think, of insight for the next 55 minutes about, I don't know, Andrew, I wrote about 30 different topic areas we could talk about. So I'm curious to know where our panelists are going to take our conversation. Excited, Andrea?
I'm excited. One of the things that I love about food is that it is the absolute canary in the coal mine, since usually if we have better economic times, we don't necessarily eat more of it. It's a matter of figuring out supply chain and shifts, and you can read a lot just from looking at food.
Wonderful. And here we are. Sometimes we always look different than our LinkedIn photos, but here's our brushed up version, the pre-pandemic version of us, I guess. And thank you again for Joanne for all of her community management. We have four absolutely great panelists. We had actually more panelists than we could deal with on this call. And I was just like, oh, we got to shrink it down to four. So popular topic. And in no particular order, but Robin O'Brien, we have her on the line. She is co-founder and CEO, I believe, of Replan Capital. She spends a lot of money in this space and has also got a really good heart in the space. She's known as a visionary thinker in the food industry. She's also an author of something called The Unhealthy Truth, and I know we've both seen a TED Talk associated with that, which not only is it interesting, it's very highly trafficked. She's founder of an advisory firm called Do Good, and she also is part of something called Allergy Kids, which I believe is a foundation. Robin, maybe just give your hi in 10 seconds of what I've missed.
Thanks so much for having me, Sean. Yeah, my heart, soul, and entire reason for being is to ensure that we have a healthy food system for healthy families and a healthy planet. So thanks so much for having me.
I love it. You've got the left and right brain of food here going on. So Dana McCauley, who I had a really interesting chat with around just Canadian food and startups and innovation a while ago. And I mentally noted, you know what, at some point we're going to have a topic where I'm going to want to have Dana back on. She is director of new venture value creation at University of Guelph, which at least in Canadian terms is kind of an epicenter for food in Canada and farming. She's also CEO of the coolest name I've run across in the last couple of months, Blue Unicorn Innovation, which is all focused around transforming invention to innovation with respect to food. She has spent a lot of time in terms of raising capital and working with startups. She's been a reality show TV host, or at least guest, I think. So she's had a number of different kind of hairnets that she's had in the space. And she's also president of a trade show and awards called SIAL. Or hopefully I'm pronouncing that right, SIAL. Welcome, Dana. What have I missed?
Not too much, just basically, I think my little niche is that I'm a front-end marketer. I know, I try to know what people are going to want tomorrow. So this topic is really interesting, and I hope to be able to talk to you guys about what's happening in the, the agri-food research, as well as in the consumer mindset.
Wonderful. All right, third in line, we've got Neil Cohen, and this is a real turnabout for us because Neil was actually the moderator of our first webcast ever. So 35 episodes ago, he was our moderator, and he did a really good job doing that. And I think I might have insulted him by not bringing him back until 34 episodes later, but he was really, really good. He is a master marketer, innovator. He's also an adjunct professor at San Francisco University, I believe. He has this crazy ability to find focus and translate that focus for probably hundreds of startups and enterprises at this standpoint. And he is a friend to Futureproofing now and next. Neil, welcome back.
Yeah, it's great to be back. And I think pertinent to this is I spent the last 10 months working with Miyoko's Creamery, helping them introduce 9 new products, amongst other things, to the folks. And for those who don't know Miyoko's, they're a plant dairy company. So hopefully I'll have some relevant comments based from my experience.
Nice. freshness. You can take me through Acetus Phyllis or whatever goes into that, all that bacteria that goes into it, and whether it actually works. Thank you for joining us again. And then last but not least, Christina Pratt. We'd like to have a global perspective on things. She's coming to us from the Netherlands today. And I was just on your website too. It's like a phenomenally interesting website. She has a company called Fuel. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. You'll tell me if I am. And you're just shaking your head, probably not. And you're all about just harnessing sustainable products and really with a consumer bent too. I mean, I was looking at some of the things in terms of just some of the things in terms of alt sodas and what have you. You're formerly from Bain and Jacob and Repsol. What have I missed, Christina? What other things we need to know about you?
No, basically our company is called Full, and you almost pronounced it correctly. We are trying to empower consumers to make a positive impact on the world while feeding them and while satisfying their cravings. So we want to make sure that everybody is empowered to choose what they eat and the way they live. In the less impactful way in our environment, but also in the rest of the different things that we can look at.
Wonderful. So you all come to us from kind of different aspects of this. This should be an interesting discussion. Maybe debate is encouraged, consensus sometimes when required. Andrea, do you have any frame up for what we're going to go through before we get right into the discussion?
Well, just one quick one, which is that to me, we talked a little bit about supply chain. We talked a little bit about technology, but one of the things that we noticed is we're excited to hear about your views on how this is all affecting the public. Of course, as Sean said, post-pandemic, we look at headlines. I mean, why did Tyson hire Dean Banks as their new CEO? You know, a tech guy from Google, moonshot, to be the CEO of Tyson. Questions like this linger in our minds, and we're curious and would love to hear all of your thoughts about this. And also, as we said, this notion of what it means, because we have people from multiple industries. And Sean and I believe that this issue is so critical globally to what's happening to all of our companies, because as we said, all of us eat, it's universal. And also food shortages, inequities, issues that we really need to think about as consumers. So this is probably the most interesting topic to me that we've had for a while. And I'm really looking forward to your viewpoints.
Wonderful. All right. Let's not deny that we've had this major life, business, society interruption over the last 5 to 6 months, maybe longer, depending on what part of your world you're in. Maybe I can just go around the horn and give your brief observation in terms of how the whole notion of food and the industry and how we consume it. I know I've seen neighbors with 100-pound packs of flour baking whatever they're doing right now. So, I mean, certainly the consumer attitudes change, but just writ large, what has changed? And maybe Robin, I'll get you to start off. Like, what are you thinking about differently than you did, let's say, November of 2019?
You know, I think that the pandemic has just completely exposed how extractive the food industry is across the board. We've seen massive food waste. We've seen troubles with the meat factories and the processing plants. We've seen COVID outbreaks in the fields with the farm workers. It's exposed how extractive our food system is. And the reason we have an extractive food system is because it's been built with an extractive financial system. And so if you think about capital as the first ingredient going in, it's really given everybody reason to pause and say, you know, on the one hand, we're watching farmers dump hundreds of gallons of milk in their fields and piles of potatoes are sitting there. And at the same time, the lines at food banks in San Antonio are wrapping around the block. So clearly there's an infrastructure problem. But again, the food system was built into that consolidation, into that extractive mode. And, you know, there's enormous profitability for those that sat at the top. And so I think, you know, with the pandemic, we can step back and we can say this consolidated extractive food system has completely failed us. It's not broken. It was designed this way, but it has failed us. And so now in this pandemic, you see the consumer stepping forward and saying, where are the opportunities to regionalize this? How can we look at the infrastructure differently? You see direct to consumer with some of the farmers. We speak to some of the ranchers and the growers, and if they have even the most basic e-commerce site on their webpage, they've been able to weather financial resiliency, weather this storm. And it's because they've got that relationship direct to consumers. So it's really been an incredible opportunity to step back and say, okay, consolidation didn't work. So what does it look like if we rethink the infrastructure of our food system?
Interesting. And my hope is that I guess we'll get to it maybe later on. I hope there's some hope around that. Where we like to call ourselves rational optimists. So my hope is we'll hear the other side of it in terms of where we can go as well later, Robin.
Definitely.
Dana, what's your perspective on the pandemic?
Yeah, I love that, Robin took that overarching structural view, because I'd like to narrow in on the personal a bit. And if you had asked me even in February or on March 1st, what were the drivers and barriers for the various demographics? There's actually 4 different distinct consumer demographics in the grocery and food service buying power dynamic right now. And if you had asked me what was affecting them and what they wanted, it would have been so different from today. And right now, we're seeing the rise of a new value consumer. We are seeing a return to the center of the grocery store, as you remarked about people buying flour. And all of a sudden, the way people in their homes are making choices is quite different. There's certainly more emphasis on local and supporting, what's near and dear to you. But it's for marketers, this is going to be a whole new lens to look at packaging claims and marketing claims. Brand story is going to be less important than community story and building trust around food safety and around employee rights and community. So it's a really interesting time. This slide I could talk for an hour about just this slide.
Oh, it's good. I know the temptation is we could just talk pandemic, which we do in some of our other lives. All right. And once again, we're all going to get back to hope again at some point, but sometimes there's the hard reality of what's happened. Thanks, Dana. Neil, what's your, you've recently had a really in-depth experience with food. How would you translate that to this?
So many. I think a couple of things, just a top line. First, I think the pandemic for a lot of people have highlighted to them how important their food choices are and that their food choices actually matter. The connectivity between what we're going through in this pandemic and almost every other pandemic over the last 200 years, between eating animals and diseases that transfer over to people, and that we're causing our own demise by eating these animals, and that there are other alternatives. We need to eat protein. We don't need to eat meat. So that kind of a thinking has kind of started to permeate, not broad enough, because you can go to some parts of the US and they don't give a rat's, but here, like, it's starting to happen. And I think it's made more people curious. It's made them understand that choice matters. And I think one other thing that's happened, especially recently, is it's tied the food system to civil rights and food justice, and the notion that that how we eat and what we eat and how our food is produced is also deeply connected to economic indisparity and how do we adjust that. And so these are things that have come up that I don't think people would have been talking about before.
Yeah, very interesting point, how they're the second order effects are, and the interconnections between those. Great. And Christina, you're coming to us from the Netherlands today. You probably have your own perspective, but perhaps as well a European perspective. What's your thoughts on the pandemic and how it's affected your company and your mindset?
Yeah, so basically our company was born in the middle or just before the pandemic, so we were quite affected at the beginning by it, although we tried to look at the positive side and trying to see opportunities and trying to take advantage on the way people is now looking at this new food system that we are all trying to build here. And I totally agree with what Dana mentioned about being more local. People are trying really to understand better where the food they are consuming comes from, but also building on what Neil said, people are looking more and more at functionality, understanding what the different ingredients and elements really give them to deal with, in this case, COVID, but also with other diseases that we might encounter along the way. So everything seems immune boosting properties, to microbiome enhancement. All these kind of different functional foods and ingredients are going to be much more demanded. And it's important also that people look at food as kind of a way to heal and kind of a way to improve their lifestyle, in my opinion.
It is interesting too. We've done some research that we asked people, what do they miss most from pre-pandemic to now? What's the thing they miss most? And almost a tie for first and second is travel and being able to go see people around the world that they really want to see, but also going to a restaurant and just having a really good meal. And so I know we're re-emerging from that, but food's a central focus of kind of feeling healthy, just mentally and spiritually again. Andrea, you want to take us through our second question here? Oops.
Yeah, so part of the thinking that we have in this community is being practical. So there's a lot of theory and worry and change and trends. So we'd love to hear your fresh thinking from the front lines. What is it that you see in your day-to-day, and how would you translate that to something more universal that people can understand about taking action, once again, in multiple industries? And I'd love to start with Christina on this one. You're coming from a different part of the world than I live in, and would love to hear, what is your fresh thinking from the front lines?
So I think people are also looking more and more, especially younger generations. You see how much they care about sustainability in terms of what they eat, what they wear, how they live. And it's quite interesting that they even put it before even health. So this shows you how this new generation, Gen Z, maybe are inspired by some leaders that are emerging now on this sustainability ecosystem, but they really care about it. So this is going to fundamentally change the way we look at the food system and the way the food system is structured. Because now many are, Gen Z or these younger consumers, they do not have the money right now, right, to pay a premium for better products, but they are going to be the consumers of tomorrow. So eventually it's for them that we have to build a new food system. And they are going to change the rules of the game completely.
So that's the beginning of some good rational optimism that Gen Z is going to come in and maybe have some fresh thinking. I have one quick follow-up, which is from your part of the world. You know, what are some of the product choices that they're making in Gen Z? What are some of the issues and product choices that are really top of mind? Like, what's one thing that you think they stand for that maybe other ones don't stand for?
So they look a lot at the procedence and the transparency of the food or the products they consume. So that's very important for them, having a clear feeling of what is inside, how this was produced, and they are also very interested in the story behind what they are buying, which is something that when you compare with the millennials or generations, other older generations, we are not that worried about it, and we look more at the health and functionality side.
That's super interesting. And the notion, and we'll come back to some of this in the follow-up topics as well, because transparency and story, when everything is in front of us, you know, you can, it's not just an ingredients list, and it's not a slogan from 20 years ago where we tell you what it is and you go, okay, great, we'll buy that. Literally, that's very interesting. So I'm going to actually segue a little bit into Robin from your perspective. One of the things that I know that, you know, maybe this was years ago, but I've been a fan of yours ever since we started seeing the work that you do in terms of leading a movement and being able to get people to become activists with regards to what you see. And so start with what you're seeing from your front lines. First of all, tell us who your front lines are, and then what are a couple of the headlines that you're seeing from the front lines?
So I need to pick up on a seed that Neil planted on justice and call this panel out a little bit, because you've got a bunch of privileged white people who are speaking to these issues right now, and there's true bifurcation that's happened. The white privilege that we all have has enabled us to sit on these panels, to work from home, to make sure our kids are safe. At the same time, the obesity epidemic, the diabetic epidemic, and the COVID epidemic are hitting families of color. And so you have to step back and say, okay, where did that intersection happen? Where did this split happen? And it really is a justice issue. And so as we talk about things like food justice, you can't talk about food justice with also tackling racial justice. You can't talk about food justice without also talking about climate justice. And you can't talk about food justice without talking about environmental justice. And so what you have to step back into is the heart of the injustice in the food system. And 96% of farm operators here in the United States are white. And the reason that they are white is because the policy was crafted that way. It was crafted to benefit the white male operator on the farm. And these are hard conversations to have. They're uncomfortable. It makes people uncomfortable. But this year alone, in 2020, half of all kids in the US that will be born are non-white. So, we're having half of a conversation here. And I think that's something that continues to happen. And it's really on all of us to step back as white leaders and voices in this movement and pass the microphone and share the mic and share the stage with our friends of color. And so that's something in my work that I'm repeatedly trying to do, because I can't speak from that experience. I can study it as much as humanly possible. I teach a course as an adjunct professor at Rice University called The New Food Economy, and the second half of the class is racism in the food system. But I can only speak from the experience that I've had, and I think we're missing half the conversation by not having our friends of color at the table.
Really appreciate that, and I have a follow-up as well. So when you look globally, how is food injustice playing out in other continents?
I mean, you see it again, with the white landowners and the people of color as the farm workers. And we were on farm right before the pandemic hit. We were on farm at Driscoll's, and Driscoll's really took it on the chin. They've had some pretty hideous headlines when it comes to the treatment and mistreatment of the farm workers. And Soren Bjorn, who is their leader, he's interesting. He's Danish, and I so appreciate that he's a global leader and he's such a systems thinker. And so he's coming at it. How can you actually redesign a strawberry field? And so, most farm workers age out at 35. It is literally backbreaking work because they're hunched over in the field harvesting all this stuff. So what he figured out how to do was actually elevate the strawberry field into this long gutter. It's made with repurposed coconut husk as the soil. It's much more efficient with water infiltration and water conservation. And that farm worker can stay engaged as a farm worker on those farms because instead of being hunched over, all of a sudden they're vertical. So there are so many opportunities. And I mean, that's where I get to hope, because it's like, it is a train wreck. What we have inherited, the injustice in our food system, is a massive train wreck, but that is also a massive opportunity. And so, when you look to Gen Z, which I happen to be the mother of 4 Gen Z kids between the ages of 15 and 20, they see it. They see it completely for what it is. And it's not all optimism and sunshine. They're sort of looking at it like, the rates of suicide are higher in our classes, Mom. The mental health issues are higher in our classes. The anxiety, the depression, it's higher. And so, the trick as a parent is, how do you actually leverage that and move them to a place of action? And I think that's, to me, if you're going to start a movement, what's the catalyst? And that's the question.
Well, let me move to Neil and then to Dana. This is a really important question. Neil, you've just been on the front lines, and you also, you have a lot of insight into this issue as well. What's your fresh thinking from the front lines?
And first, before I even jump onto that, Robin, exactly. And I think it's important to understand that it's set up governmentally to support that we have to understand that programs that the government runs, where they subsidize dairy and they subsidize meat, and they have checkoff programs, and they create this unlevel playing field.
Absolutely.
That forces poor nutrition on people of color. That's a big part of this, and we can talk about that later. But if you want to take my biggest takeaway, it's funny, as a marketer, you see how people go out into the market and talk about the changes and what's going on and how they're going to present themselves. And one of my things is that the revolution is over. And people might say, like, what do you mean the revolution's over? It hasn't, the market share isn't there and all that kind of stuff. But you have to understand the mindset has changed with people, that people are willing to try vegan options, alternative options. If you look at some places in the state of California and the East Coast and other places where fluid milk, non-dairy alternatives have taken over more than 40 to 50% of the dairy case. And so you see this change that is taking place. And, you know, they put Beyond Meat and Impossible in the meat section, and they start performing at an equal level to their meat counterparts. When things are equal, when you can have the taste and nutrition that people want and expect, they will switch. So that mindset is changing. You can see it in other subtle ways. For example, if you go to when we went to a restaurant before, but even if you go now, there isn't vegan options and they mix everything together. The vegan dishes, they are amazing. They taste phenomenally delicious, right? And so this change has taken place over time, even to the point where if you look at our retail partners, they're having extensive private label lines that are all plant-based. You know, the supermarkets don't go into a private label unless it's, you know, cranking, you know, and they want to get a piece of that pie without taking the margin away. So, you know, this is the thing I want to tell everybody. The revolution is over. People have accepted it. It's now upon the industry and the food system to create products that are going to meet the taste and performance that omnivores demand before they switch over.
Well, let's let Dana comment on what you've heard a little and then add your fresh thinking from the front lines.
Yeah, there's a lot here to unpack, but to be succinct, I think that that in some ways our circumstances right now, we have you know, people not as mobile as they used to be. We have more resistance to having people come into our homes from you know, any kind of service perspective, and we're all at least below that top 1%. We're all feeling economic pressure in various markets, more so than others. Here in Canada, where I am, the government has been, I think, quite phenomenal in making sure that people still can have access to food. Certainly our food banks are being used more, but we aren't seeing some of the desperation that I see in other countries that don't have the social democracy matrix that we have here in Canada. But regardless, everyone is becoming, as I mentioned earlier, that value consumer to some extent. So if you're at a premium tier, you're trading down, and if you're at a normal tier, you're trading down to value. And what I think is potentially very good about that, and that ties into what Robin was expressing, is that in the past, and I've been an executive lead of innovation at, you know, $2.5 billion food companies, $110 million food companies, done a lot of work selling into the US as well as Canada and a little bit abroad. And we always looked at the value tier as just the place to sell the most basic gut fill at the cheapest price. And I think that's going to change, because when you have millennial mom going from shopping at Target or Whole Foods now going to a value tier, here in Canada, a good example would be Giant Tiger, Aldi potentially in the US and abroad. When you see her going into that store to shop, she is still wanting to find all those touch points we talked about, you know, like that brand story, the quality of the ingredients, the health benefits. But she has, and I say she specifically because still in most industrialized markets, it's the mother who of the household, or the female leader of the household, who makes the decisions about what to buy and cook. Although that's changing in a lot of places. Anyhow, long story short, I think it's going to behoove marketers to really focus on how they can put true value, so triple bottom line value for themselves as well as for the consumer into those products. Because grocers are only going to list products for two reasons. One, to sell more to the people in their stores. So therefore, those top tier stores are going to have to look at those elements and make sure that's in their offering. And two, to attract new people to their stores. And those value chains are smart. I've been reading a lot about them. The dollar banners are expanding, adding refrigerators, adding freezers, adding fresh sections, and you will definitely see them trying to steal share from the more established grocers. And in turn, their traditional customers will benefit as well. It's a shame that we didn't put them first, but there is actually some hope, I think, for there to be more access to food and other CPG products that are a little more democratically priced.
Well, back to you, Sean. Let's go to the next topic. There's so much to talk about. We could probably spend 2 hours on this.
Or more. I've been thinking a lot about just the value chain and just, you know, in Canada, the biggest grocery chain is Loblaws. And I just marveled the fact, despite all this chaos going around us, I can still go to my store and with relative ease find a lot of things on my shelf that I would have been able to know. And so it's almost like interior plumbing for me. I don't know how it all happens, but it's amazing that it does. I know that isn't the case for the developing world and other places, but so for me on this one, just this whole, you know, from you know, farm or wherever food comes from to the plate, you know, I had 3 thoughts in mind. Just the resiliency of, you know, trying to feed a planet of 8 billion people, soon to be 11 billion. It's kind of crazy. The whole notion of the pandemic and how traceability and trust has come into play. I spent a lot of time looking at blockchain last year and different food relevant things in terms of traceability. And this whole notion that I think, you know, people writ large are kind of looking at organic and craft and something that's more local and has a story behind it than they might have normally a decade or 2 decades ago, where it was the trusted #1 brand that you might have gone for. So with that in mind, maybe we'll start in a different path. Neil, why don't you go first, and we'll try to resort the order.
Again, every one of these things has so much to unpack. You know, I think, you know, you have here seed to plate. And I think one of the biggest things right now is you see this, we have one of our panelists, Christina, is working on it right now, which is ingredients, new ingredients that maybe we've never used or had before that are going to become part of the supply chain. You know, Full is doing an ingredient brand, and, you know, Christina can talk to it more. We were talking ahead of time, but how do you discover plants and leverage them and extract the power out of them that was never extracted before, and using them in novel and unique ways? You know, again, I just came from a plant dairy company where you're trying to create, you know, cheeses. You know, you're trying to create substrates from different, you know, nuts or seeds or plants to create something that tastes great. And it's not as easy to do as you think. But then once you find that, how do you get a steady supply chain? How do you get somebody to grow that? How do you get somebody to process it? I would also say system capacity for the new food economy is horrible right now. And so if you're a company that's coming out with a new product, your ability to find a co-packer or manufacturer or manufacturing facility without building out your own infrastructure is almost near impossible. I'm already working with 4 or 5 different companies that are trying to go out and make things, and they can't make them because they can't find plant capacity to manufacture what they want. And you might think, how is that possible? But it is. And so you've got this idea of what are the new plants or that are going to be out there that are going to need to be manufactured or grown at scale. How are we going to make the food, this new food, when it comes out, because it's not made the same way? And those are 2 big issues. And I think that there's a lot of opportunity out there around this whole thing of creating this value chain. You know, getting back to Rama's initial, this is an economic opportunity for the world, that you can invest in these different areas, and it's just all greenfield, pun intended. You know, so a lot to talk about here, but I'll give up and let somebody else get started.
No, it's interesting, the thread of just this whole industry is built on a tower of cards, isn't it? Like everything's interconnected, and even if you have a good idea, how do you get that to? That's an interesting systematic challenge, right? Yeah. Christina, you were mentioned by Neil so cleverly in his comments. How are you facing kind of your introduction of a product, seed to plate?
Yeah, so it's our whole thesis when we created this company was how can we allow people to reduce their carbon footprint while eating and drinking. That was our whole point, and normally consumption is directly associated with somehow unsustainable part of your day, right? Because you are consuming something that has taken effort and has incurred in carbon emissions in order to reach your plate. So how can we transform and unlock opportunities that would allow us to use ingredients that actually capture more carbon dioxide during its production process than it actually consume while they go through the rest of the supply chain. And as Neil was saying, there is a systematic issue because impact comes with scale. So we are a small company, we can unlock opportunities, we can point out at best solutions, but we have to have a supply chain and a distribution in place. And without scale, we cannot have the impact that we want to eventually have. So that's the chicken and the egg problem that we are trying to solve. And that's why, and now maybe we are kind of deviating a little bit, but it's a very good moment to say so. That's why the cooperation between big companies and startups is so important because the change that we are facing and that needs to happen, it's going to be a joint effort among all of us. So it's not only small companies, but also you need the private and public sector also helping and supporting the change. And I mean, everybody has to do something about it, from the consumer to the producers, to the farmers, and to the big companies that own the distribution channels.
Interesting. And it feels like a little bit like other industries. It's like the big companies have merged and have gotten bigger, like the Nestle's of the world. The startups have got a lot of gravitas recently because, like, you know, I think they're more spot on with consumer preference. This whole middle band of companies that I used to work with when I was a junior brand manager at Procter & Gamble, I don't see a lot of them anymore. Like trying to achieve scale in this business seems like it's a bit of a challenge because of the value chain. Robin, you might have a similar or different lens on this. Where do you want to take us on the whole value chain?
I just think you have to follow the money, and you have to look at the way that capital is allocated at the federal level. You look at the subsidy program and how few crops we actually subsidize here in the U.S. Yeah. So all of the capital is getting sucked into this few, making it harder for the many. And then on top of that, not only is the capital sucked into the subsidy system, but then the crop insurance program is wrapped around that as well. So if a farmer wanted to transition to a different crop, say to provide more plant-based pea protein or something, they have to let go of this capital structure that's wrapped around their system. And I mean, that's really hard to do, especially when you consider that in the United States, and I know it's not alone, I mean, New Zealand's got a similar problem, but in the US, our farmers are $426 billion in debt, and the average farm income is something like negative $1,500. I mean, try to convince anybody to go into business with $426 billion in debt and a negative income that you're going to somehow support your family. I mean, it's crazy. It's crazy. So to step back and say, how do we actually create transition finance, which is what we're doing at Replant Capital? What does it look like to actually create a renewable regenerative capital system? Because what we've got right now is a massively extractive capital system, and that's the underpinning of this food system. So it's absolutely no wonder that the whole thing is crashing down.
Yeah. It's I mean, we brought up race earlier, and race is a multi-generational issue with a lot of different baggage and legacy. It seems like the agricultural system has the same kind of stickiness in terms of some of the challenges to it.
Sean, it's almost like if somebody told you communications is a big area of growth and you put all your money in the pager business right now.
No, exactly. If any farmer had any actuarial cousins, they would advise, please don't launch here, right? It doesn't seem like a safe bet, but there's some passion involved. Dana, play anchor person for us on this one. Just and we're getting to the sixth inning, and to use a horrible North American baseball metaphor. So just the next couple topics we'll go a little bit quicker on. But oh, you're muted, I believe, Dana.
Sorry about that, folks. My dog came in a while ago and I wanted to save you his barking. I'd like to take this conversation back a few steps. There's been some really great points, but just the fact that you called this a value chain is a place to pause. Because I often use this metaphor. My career, I've gotten further away from people's mouths. I started as a chef, then I was in media, then I was a product developer and food business executive, and now I work with academics. And at every point along what we've always called a chain, there are lots of touch points and loop backs, and this is one of the problems. It's not a simple chain that you can take apart and put back together. It is extremely complex. It's a network, and I do think technology is going to help us with that. I'm not super sold on the magic bullet of blockchain, as you know, Sean, we've talked about that, but I do see big projects happening nationally and internationally. We're working at the University of Guelph on AgriData Canada. I know that players like Farm Credit Canada and IBM and many others are also trying to kind of solve these puzzles. And where I'm seeing a lot of really interesting stuff pop up among the researchers I work with at the university is around different ways to use data to identify what should be grown where, when it should be grown, when it should be harvested, when it should be watered. So there's all that sensor technology. There's a lot of really cool DNA barcoding science that is coming out that's really helping to add more transparency to the food system along that chain of custody, and seeing a lot faster response times to crises like, you know, romaine lettuce that needs to be recalled and that kind of thing. So I think the value chain needs to speak to each other a bit more. Even I live in a rural area. I used to live right downtown Toronto, a 54th floor of a condo. Now I live on 26 acres out in the country. My neighbors are all farmers. And even here in a rural community, the people who aren't living on farm don't really get what the farmers do. They often underestimate what sophisticated business people they are. Most of the farmers I know have master's degrees in agronomy. And there's not necessarily and they don't necessarily understand what people who don't live on farms need and want. So we've got to get everybody with the same information, looking at things through a similar lens. The good news is I'm seeing policymakers really interested in these topics. I run a program at the university called the Policy Fellowship, and it's for people who are working at making agri-food policy. And it's just for Canadians at this point, but we get international people wanting to come on campus, talk to the researchers, find out what they are doing and tell them what they need to know from them. And that is a really compressing the knowledge mobilization that's required to really create a chain that's strong and that makes sense.
Interesting. Masters of agronomy too. So they not only have to be financially in debt, they also have to be well educated now too. Andrea, take us to our next topic.
Yeah, I want to do this one quickly. Is this our last one or the second to last?
We just have around the horn after.
Okay, so this is what we'll call the lightning round. And anything that you can give us in terms of these insights that you would give as a little bit of advice, perhaps, you know, how do we translate one key insight into one key innovation? So I'll give you an example. We worked for HEB in Texas years ago, and they said, tell us who our competition is. And it was a grocery store. And they named all the grocery stores they wanted us to benchmark. And we said, well, your first thing is that you need to change the list. We think Walmart's going to be your new competition. They're like, no way. They're not selling groceries. Well, of course, now they are. So insight, innovation. Okay, who wants to go first? Raise your hand. Insight, innovation. What insight have you had and what innovation do you recommend?
I want to make Christina go first. She's
yeah, you're doing it. Okay, Christina, you want to go first? Let's do it. What insight and what innovation? A quick one.
Okay. I'd say nature has provided us with enough resources to feed our population. So why are we not using those resources in the right way instead of completely completely getting rid of the resources for future generations. So it has to be a smart way, and technology and innovation can help us find it, that will allow us to use the natural resources in a way that it's more efficient than what we do now.
Great. Robin, one quick insight, one quick innovation. These are the short ones.
So I would say that soil is an incredible database. And, you know, right now we get really myopic and all anybody talks about is carbon, and there's sort of this whole carbon washing thing that's starting to happen. But soil as a database is so incredibly resourceful and so full of information that impacts our health. It impacts food quality. It impacts nutrient density. It impacts water conservation. It impacts water infiltration. It impacts climate health. So to think about soil as a database and all of the opportunities for innovation around that.
That's really provocative. Dana, what's your quick one? Insight, innovation.
Yeah, I think if I were approached by somebody who said, I've got $1 million and I want to start a food business, I would tell them to focus on the immunity and health space as a platform. And I think a company that has that as a brand promise can do things like Neil and Christina are doing, can do things like Robin is talking about, can do things that are very empathetic to the consumer. And that's a platform that has a lot of elasticity.
Right. And Neil, the quick one on this, what insight, what innovation?
Yeah, I think the thing to look at is, you know, as people move towards more alternative choices, that it can't be vegan for vegans anymore. It has to be vegans for omnivores. And you cannot underestimate the importance of taste, performance, and nutrition, and how that will play a role in converting people over, because you can talk about sustainability, you can talk about health, you can talk about cruelty to animals, but people are selfish, as we see what's going on right now politically. It's just, I won't wear a mask, let alone, you know, like change what I eat. So, you know, all things being equal, people will make that switch if they feel like they're not sacrificing taste and nutrition.
Great. So Sean, I'll let you wrap us to the last round the horn and then close us out.
Yeah, and I guess on this one, maybe I'll take a particular tack. Just very quickly, guys, if you can just, you know, you all seem to be very active listeners. Maybe tell us what you've learned today, just having this mishmash of 4 really interesting brains together, and give us some hope, like something that we can take away for the future that you go, wow, it's not all kind of crisis and pandemic and whatever. Let's try to rise up. Let's try to rise above it and see where the hope exists. And Robin, you started us off in the first round, Robin. Yeah. So what did we learn and some hope?
I just think every crisis is an opportunity. And so, you know, if you look at the comments made about HEB, which I am from Texas and a huge fan of that grocery store chain and the leadership there, you know, they were able to look ahead at the data that they were collecting from overseas ahead of the COVID pandemic hitting the US, and they were able to leverage that. And so, you know, I think you've touched on it, Sean. I think the art of listening is incredibly important. And to listen not only to the consumer, to listen to the executives, to listen to the farmers. We have really lost that art. We're all quick to jump onto our social media platforms and act as experts. And I think what is really critical is to listen.
Well, you know what, that could be a conclusion on nearly every one of our webcasts, couldn't it, Robin? This is a societal issue, which just happens to be a food related one today. Thank you for that. Dana, what's your learning from our panel and hope?
Well, I think we are at an inflection point. My first book was called Last Dinner on the Titanic, and the thesis of it was about how the sinking of the Titanic basically ended the Edwardian period, and we moved into a whole new time. And I think that we're on one of those brinks right now. And as Robin said, that brings with it opportunity. And it also is hastening us, the COVID pandemic is hastening us towards change in the food service industry and in the way we eat at home and the sensitivity we have for the food system. And as long as we really pay attention to that and we act act on it, and maybe put aside, some of the partisanship that certainly seems to be just built into human beings to have. I think we can rebuild some of these broken structures in stronger ways. And I would urge everybody to be, thinking about, okay, well, what can I do to help fix this? And at the individual level, that could be volunteering. At the CEO level, that could be really listening to the needs of the community. I know that fiduciary duty is paramount when you run a company. You have to make decisions that make the shareholders more money, but maybe there's a way to start working with boards and say to them, okay, I will make you money, but I will also produce these other types of value, and we will, make that a choice. And that would be my challenge to the senior leaders on this webinar, and to the individuals who are feel like they don't have power. I'm like, yeah, get out there, work with a food bank, make your neighbor a cake. It can be like literally the smallest thing can change. It makes them change.
Yeah. Wonderful. Christina, biggest soundbite here. Give me the slogan. Hope, learning. What is it?
So for me, it's about the similarities between the pandemic and the change that has to happen in the food system that we have. And when I say similarities, I mean basically our food system is broken or is not working efficiently, as we already mentioned today. And everybody knows that, but nobody is really taking it with a sense of urgency that it requires, same as with the health system and with everything that was mentioned before about possible future pandemics. I remember this podcast from years ago that outlined this, and no one really took it seriously, right? So this has showed us that what is not urgent today can be urgent tomorrow. And the good news is that we are not too late. We have to work on this, and this pandemic has showed us that if we all work together, we can deal with everything. So now it's the moment to act, and the sooner the better.
Wonderful sentiment and words. And Neil, you know how this works. We got to get out at the 55-minute mark. So give me the glorious 50 words of wisdom.
Well, what I learned even more so is that the challenges with the food system is structural. But structural change comes when it's always framed as an economic issue over the long time. And consumers have the power. They have the power right now. They're making choices, and compassionate capitalism is working. People are switching. People are changing their behaviors. And government is taking notice. You've got people like Cory Booker and Bernie Sanders and others that, and that are trying to help legislate the change that needs to happen structurally. But what's happening is consumers are leading the charge. Gen Z, boomers, everybody are making better choices. And to the point that Dana was saying, it's like, you can volunteer, but just buying something from the new food economy is a choice that makes a difference. And everybody thinks it's hopeless. It's not hopeless, because little things in aggregate make a huge difference. So if we can drive it from the consumer side, the rest will come, and consumers are starting to make the smart choices. Maybe government and big ag will make the same choices going forward.
Fascinating. I was quite educated today, guys. Like, we did it in 55 minutes, so small little congratulations for all of us. It's tough with a panel of 4. Just quickly, some housekeeping as we go out. Here's our panelists. I'm sure you can spot them on LinkedIn or their various companies. I'm sure they'd all be interested to hear your observations. We'll be posting this webcast to a number of different webcast and podcast channels over the next few days. We do have this thing called the Gray Swan Guild. We've just launched a leadership document. If you get a chance, go to grayswanguild.org. It's pretty cool stuff. There's a lot of interesting stuff around leadership as we go in the future. And our next webcast episode, Andrea has pulled together what will turn into an activity deck of cards. I'm a big poker player, so I like this topic. The 88 triggers to innovation. And so those things and lines of inquiry that you look at and go, I wonder what question I could ask somebody to elicit such a great idea or improvement or way to get to next. So Andrea, why don't you take us home?
I just think that the concept of Texas Hold'em for business innovation is long overdue. I think this was one of the most interesting global sets of perspectives on probably my favorite topic, which is what matters to all of us. So I thank the panel and Sean. It's always amazing how much we can learn in 1 hour. And we feel like we've been a little bit closer to everybody in the world. So amazing. Dana, Robin, Neil, Christina, thank you so much. And we had a question from the audience, which we'll post in an email, and perhaps you're open to responding to it, because that would be great. And thank you so much, and see everybody in the future.